Hi, we do not have a recording from our Wednesday meeting, which I'm pretty devastated about because the conversation that we had about Malcolm X, Ibram Kendi, and W.E.B. Du Bois really was excellent. What we did was I made this Padlet, which you can link to right through Blackboard. If you go to our Malcolm X folder, remember this is how you open and close the drop-down menu. In the Malcolm X folder, there is the Malcolm X Padlet. And the question is, how do Malcolm X, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Ibram Kendi comparatively narrate their childhood? How does each of them define a positive Black identity, meaning a way of thinking about themselves that is not racist and that is not shaped only by double consciousness? And then the other question for the Padlet asks how they define racism. So the quotes are in the order that we posted them, and Barak and I each grabbed a quote. His come out as anonymous, unfortunately. And you can add your posts to this Padlet and join in the conversation in this way if you would like. But one of the first posts that we talked about was a comparison that Barak made between Malcolm X measuring himself when he straightens his hair against this ruler or yardstick that is that of a white man. And he actually says, hey, my hair is real red, as straight as any white man. And that's an example of not looking directly at himself in the mirror, but looking in the mirror and imagining a white person's image and viewpoint, and then seeing himself. It's an excellent example of double consciousness. Paired with that is another post about from Kendi where he says, as a speaker, as a young man, our youth's minds are still in captivity. And certainly we can see in that case that Kendi's mind Malcolm X's mind is in captivity because he thinks he's only valuable if he measures himself by a white standard of straight hair. The entire speech that Kendi gives that he regrets making, that he says was racist, is also a standard of viewpoints about African American culture that tend to come from a white viewpoint rather than from a survey of African American community leaders or community members themselves. Nonetheless, we can find examples of positive Black identity and internalized racism at the same time. And here is a good example from W.E.B. Du Bois on that. First, he claims that work culture and liberty, all these we need, not singly but together. And by together, he means that Black and white people in the United States will coalesce, will come together, and will find a higher meaning in the ideal of race. Not the idea of race that has to do with superiority, but the ideal of race, which is that we are different. We have different identities. We have different experiences, histories, and ways of relating to the world that very often are shaped by our race, as well as our gender, our class, and a variety of other factors. However, Du Bois reverts into a really common idea during his lifetime, which is that races almost naturally have distinct traits. So when we use the word trait, he says the ideals of fostering the traits and talents. Traits is a word that rings with this genetic idea that Kendi refutes using genetics and science. Du Bois probably doesn't fully buy into a genetic or biological idea of race. However, it's so prevalent in his lifetime that he moves in and out of it to make sense to his audience, who are very firmly entrenched in those scientific ideas of race. So long story short, what he's saying is that, yes, the ideal of race is that African Americans have traits that differ from white Americans, whether or not you believe that happened through history and heritage and experience, or whether you think people naturally have different personalities, characters, etc. The latter being a slightly racist idea. But nonetheless, what Du Bois wants to say is that there are characteristics of African Americans that complete the mission, the greater ideals of the American Republic, that complete the ongoing process of revolution that brings us to complete freedom. And I'm kind of rambling on here. However, it does suggest that Black nationalism, or someone like Marcus Garvey, is evidence that race has grown into something good, not just the father of racism. So the idea of race is not always negative, and certainly racial difference isn't negative, because Du Bois wants to feel on learning, creating differences among cultures that are powerful. At the same time, he does play into this idea of traits, which is dangerous because it plays into scientism and the genetics. Barak did a really wonderful job of explaining all of this and speaking about it eloquently, and sadly, the technology failed and I don't have the recording. Now, some other things that I pointed out as to the reasons Malcolm X could develop a positive Black identity did include his references to Marcus Garvey. Some of the people that visited Malcolm's family after his father's death were people they knew through the Garvey movement. And when Malcolm X talks about the white man, he uses metaphors. So he says that as a child, he played a game matching nickels with a white boy, and the white boy won all of his money. And he realized that if someone always wins in a game, they must have rigged the game. Therefore, when the boy wins all his money, he swindles Malcolm, he cheated him. So in this anecdote, or this story of his childhood, Malcolm X isn't saying this white boy was a jerk, I don't like white boys. Rather, he's saying that because of racial power dynamics, the game is rigged in favor of white people. And he uses metaphors like that frequently. And often when he's talking about the white man, he's using metaphors that don't point toward his dislike of white people, because he says a lot of good things about white people, if you notice throughout the book. Rather, when he says the white man, he talks about the citizen of the republic who is endowed with all of the property, the rights, and the privileges of American identity. But because of the way policy and government and economics are set up, access to the same thing is not available to Black men and women. So one of the problems people have with Malcolm X is that he seems abrasive because he says the white man. But try to think about that metaphorically, not about, specifically, my dad, Whitey. Actually, my grandfather's nickname is Whitey. I try not to take it personally. And let me think. I tried to then begin to summarize what Barak was saying and make comments that would reflect the direction of our conversation. And hopefully we can replicate that conversation somewhat and make sure that it gets recorded next week, because it was really powerful. So if you would like for extra credit to read through this Padlet and even add to the Padlet and do the discussion in this format rather than on the discussion board, please do include your comments. Part of the reason for the comparison and the specific question is that when I do give back all of the papers, I will give you some specific suggestions for revision, but then I will also ask you to add on to the first paper so that you can also talk about Malcolm X. Then you will have a draft of the second paper. So it's not that I'm adding another paper, it's that I'm making the paper a continuous scaffolded process. And reading through and sharing your ideas in this Padlet will be helpful to you as you finally do get your feedback, which I promise is coming soon if you submitted a paper. If you didn't submit a paper yet, go ahead and try to talk about Malcolm X, Du Bois, and Kendi all in the same swoop, but that's it's a lot to take on. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Have a great weekend.